Eric Delente, why don't you kick us off, Senior Director, Wearable Centers at Medidata. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so I run a new offering that was just launched, which is Sensor Cloud, which basically standardizes and normalizes data from different types of wearable sensors, primarily for use in clinical trials. I came to Medidata after 25 years of experience in the healthcare industry. I created one of the first electronic informed consent systems that is now probably the most widely used ones, and now really excited to be on my next journey here at Medidata, leading the wearable sensors efforts and incorporating wearable sensors into clinical trials.
Thanks. Rich Feeley, professor at Boston University, over to you.
Okay, I'm retired from the Department of Global Health, and my story is a personal one that predates COVID, but shows, I think, how digital technologies can actually be used to resolve some mental health problems that I couldn't find any other way to address. So that's my introduction, but I don't think I'm the next one on the agenda, am I? Hello? Anybody out there?
Apologies.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So again, my colleague Prem seems to have some microphone and headset issues. So yeah, you are. And thank you, Rich, for the background. And Antoinette, if you could give a little bit of introduction about yourself as well.
Sure. So I'm Antoinette Schoenthaler. I'm associate professor in the Department of Population Health and the Center for Healthful Behavior Change at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, where I lead the psychosocial unit. My work uses a health equity lens to improve medication adherence in vulnerable populations in New York City, employing mHealth technologies as a primary way to improve health outcomes.
That's wonderful. Let's kick off there, Antoinette. I think everyone in the audience wants to know, how is telehealth shaping the future of virtual first healthcare for better and more accessible healthcare and better outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something we're kind of dealing with now. I think, telehealth is becoming more widespread more rapidly. And while it's improving access in some ways, particularly for populations who had transportation issues, who needed more anytime, anywhere type services, we're kind of looking at it more from a health equity lens in terms of language concordance and are the services available to people who English is not the first language? Is access a major barrier in places like, Upper West Side, Harlem, where you are or where I am, and Sunset Park, where access is sporadic at best. So I think while it's been a great bridge in some ways, there's new questions that are arising that we have to answer.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing the growth of it. I think everyone's in agreement now, violent agreement about how it's growing so fast, and the technologies are getting better every day. Eric, how does this idea of telehealth and passive data collection for intelligent medication solutions play a role in the ethics and the equity of clinical trials? Medidata is the top clinical trial software company in the world, and how does this work with what you guys are doing in clinical trials?
Well, in terms of equity and access to healthcare, I think there are statistics out there that tell us that at least a quarter, if not more, of patients who participate in clinical trials are unhappy that they have to travel so far to go to a particular site. But I think there's a parallel there with any kind of healthcare situation. So, my Medidata is Medidata's tool for creating a patient-facing or a participant-facing application that gives them access to all their clinical trial data, but also provides a window into being able to have their sites virtually, their site visits virtually. So just not having to drive is a very simple example of that. Beyond that, I think there are all kinds of actual clinical benefits as well. If you think about the fact that typically in a clinical trial, and even in our own healthcare, we go see our doctor once a year for a physical, and we get our blood pressure checked one time. But with these technologies, we can check our blood pressure anytime. There's even things like transdermal imaging, where I can just hold a phone up to my face and get an accurate measure, basically a validated measurement of my blood pressure anytime I want, and that goes into my personal health record. So all those kinds of things that simplify and lower the barriers for patients to access their data, but also to improve their access to healthcare as well. I think one thing that's been in the news lately as well is, for example, pulse oximeters have been discovered to be less accurate with people who have darker skin. And that's an example of something that has to be fixed. But as the industry broadens, as we see more of these kinds of applications being used, we learn more about it, and it'll be up to the sensor manufacturers to correct those problems. But as you said, we hear a lot about this stuff being, this is a benefit, that COVID-19, this helps us get through the pandemic. But honestly, these things are beneficial way beyond the pandemic as well, from practicality, from access, and from equity as well.
I totally agree. And we're seeing that go all over the world. And I think, Rich, you've had some personal experience with medication intelligence and just, having these kinds of electronic adherence tools at your disposal. Tell us a little bit about from a personal level, how that's impacted your life.
Well, it's made all the difference for my son, who's now in his early 30s and holding down a good job as a sports editor for a small city newspaper. But when he was in his early 20s, although he had a good relationship with his psychiatrist, he would not regularly take his meds. And when he did, he had self-management issues. And he was probably better for both him and us that he lived alone. But it was clear that when he was on his meds, he was fine. When he was off, he wasn't. My colleagues were running an experiment in China with people on ARVs, and found, using the MEMS cap, the memory cap on a pill bottle, and they found positive results with adherence. And I said, "Oh, is that stuff available generally?" And they said, "Well, call up and find out." Anyhow, I signed up and I worked out with him a arrangement where he would use those bottles and I would come by once a month and read the output and see if he'd been taking his pills when he should, and established an incentive for him to comply. And over time, what he learned was that he himself, as he matured, understood that by taking his meds, he was in control and he could do what he wanted to do and hold down a job and all those good things. But we never would have gotten through that transition without that technological ability to monitor and incentivize his taking his meds. So, that's one personal story. But I think today, when it's harder to go see a mental health professional, and when people are alone, it may be even more important for those folks to have some way to, monitor, or have someone else help them monitor and get through the kind of transition that my son got through. So that's my personal pre-COVID story.
No, it's a powerful story too. Thank you, Professor Feeley, about that. I think, looking at what we've seen over the years, just in my research as well, looking at passive data collection through things like the information mediary ECAP and the Medic Pack. You're just seeing these sorts of passive data collection tools in clinical trials, and now also moving into the consumer grade and into the consumer population on a commercial basis is just super powerful. It's completely passive, and it oftentimes goes back to the clinical trial manager, the sponsor. It goes back to the care manager, the health plan. Antoinette, talk to us a little bit about your experience with these sorts of technologies and these intelligent medication solutions like ECAP and whatnot. And should these things be a part of a GCP toolkit with FDA clinical trials these days? Is the technology that advanced and that effective?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I use them in my work mainly as a measurement tool, but I think there's so much potential for them if we can get the right coverage. I think, health insurance and coverage is always a question in terms of affordability of these tools, and that's perhaps why they're limited to the research space. But I think so. I mean, we know in my own work, although I use it as an outcome measure, that it changes behavior. Once you're tracking and self-monitoring is a very powerful intervention in itself. And so that ability to know what you're doing doing and how often and how well is a motivator for change. And so we're currently using these tools to then feed it back into our electronic health record system at NYU to provide providers and even medical assistants a dashboard of patients' adherence. So we can be more proactive, and so not waiting until there's a non-adherence is causing some kind of adverse event, but then if we see these dips in adherence, we can do, informed outreach. So I think so. I think it's a great mechanism for a feedback loop for the patient, for the provider, if we can make it a coverable expense, just like a blood pressure monitor or any other device.
Yeah, and Eric, again, Medidata, the leading software provider in clinical trials, building on what Antoinette is saying and talking about these investments in these clinical trials technologies. Ultimately, clinical trials are measuring medication, its safety, its effectiveness, on top of other things like devices, et cetera. But a lot of the efficacy of medication is around the frequency and the timing of the dosing. What's your perspective on this? How do we invest in these technologies to ensure that clinical trials have this fundamental measurement of when a patient's interacting with their medication?
Yeah, and so like medication adherence, beyond even the smart pill bottles and small blister packs and things like that, that does give us a clear indication of if they're taking it. I think to Antoinette's point, just knowing that you're being monitored for this, it enhances compliance and adherence. I think it goes beyond adherence as well and into other things, like just being able to know that there's a concept of white coat syndrome, right? When you're going to the doctor and so you're nervous and so different vital signs may vary because of that. And that's one measurement, maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every month. Whereas with the continuous measurement, this passive data collection, as you were referring to it, I can have 100 measurements in a day. And I might uncover something that's not detected in a single measurement. And these are all things that advise, whether it's a clinical trial or whether it's actually just your healthcare provider, to understand how different vital signs are responding to when you took your medication, if you didn't take your medication, even, are you exercising? Are you standing up? Activity monitors, things like that. They can all contribute to paint a much, much deeper and richer picture of a particular individual's health. And in addition to that, it also, you don't have to go to your EHR to pull your data back. Your data is already with you and you can share it as you see fit. So you have a little bit more ownership of that data beyond just the travel exceptions and all of that. I hope I answered the question correctly.
No, that's absolutely accurate. And again, Professor Feeley, coming from one of the preeminent schools of public health in America, Boston University, and having done so much research in your time, and now having this personal case study of understanding how important it was within your own family. What's your perspective, particularly in clinical trials where it's that medication interaction that patients have, the timing is so important, the frequency is so important to really understand whether the efficacy is truly what it needs to be, and the safety certainly is what it needs to be. Should these sorts of technologies, now that the costs have come down so substantially and they're being implemented globally now many times over again over the last 10 years, should these be a part of a standard FDA trial?
Well, it's hard for me to say on trials. I know that my colleagues found in China that this did make a difference. The stuff on trials that have used phone monitoring of use are variable. I'm actually more interested in seeing it in regular practice. I was amazed when I followed up on this that nobody seemed to have done it. And I think Dr. Schoenthaler's point is important. Okay, so I had a good job at BU. I could afford to buy this. And it was important to me because it was important for me to see my son work through this. It's not going to happen unless there's support for this kind of this kind of technology used in regular practice. So that's what I hope. I don't think this is a one-off. I think for young people who are in a transition, my son's case, high functioning Asperger's syndrome, where their late teens, early 20s are particularly difficult. I think you would see more good results, but there's going to have to be coverage for this kind of thing. I think Dr. Schoenthaler is absolutely right.
And so let's go back to the clinical trial side. It's a great conversation. And you know, doctor, what's your perspective? You've done a lot of clinical trials. Is this something that we should have as a part of FDA, GCP, standards? Should there be some sort of passive technology ensuring that when patients that are interacting with their medications, when they are supposed to be interacting with their medications, so that when we finalize and lock the actual database at the end of the clinical trial, we know that it was generally that the protocol was followed generally along the lines of what it was meant to follow.
I mean, I definitely think so. Just as we're handing out blood pressure monitors for remote patient monitoring and other devices, glucometers, why not an adherence bottle? Blood pressure won't get better, or your glucose, if you don't take your medications as prescribed. And so, why leave any doubt in that equation? We know that providers estimate adherence less than 50% of the time correctly. So there's a lot of room for error there. So it seems like a win-win if you're kind of thinking about clinical, economic, different types of quality of life, different types of outcomes for patients and providers.
That's great. Yeah, and Eric, again, Medidata has gone beyond just being a software company. It's now like the app store of software and clinical trials. Since it's got about 70% of the clinical trials globally running its software, now it's the connectivity. So all the ECAPs on the the medication distribution side, the blood pressure monitors, the wearable wristbands for activity or sleep. I know that what you have been doing, and certainly Glenn and Tarek are doing, is extraordinary in bringing this ecosystem together through a single platform. What kind of things are you guys doing with medication adherence, and what kind of things are you doing with intelligent medication solutions?
So with medication adherence is something that's kind of new for us. There's skepticism in that, yes, you took the pill out of the bottle, but did you actually swallow it, or did you give it to your dog, right? And so those are the things we have to show. But the statistics are definitely showing that, maybe we're not sure 100%, but there's a significant improvement in the adherence. There's also the other side of the equation where what if the medication is actually creating some other problem? Like, does it elevate your blood pressure? Is it raising your temperature? Are you sweating more? What's in your sweat? Those kind of things with different types of sensors like that. I think it's important to point out, like, that in 2019, as of 2019, I think maybe 10 to 15% of clinical trials were using sensors. And there is research conducted by Intel that was further worked on by Kaiser Associates that points to an estimate of 70% of clinical trials will use sensors by 2025. Right now, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with clinical trials, but there's an idea of a primary endpoint and a secondary endpoint and an exploratory endpoint. Most of the data that comes in from clinical trials right now are exploratory endpoints, insofar as they support or they don't support other data, which is primary evidence. But we want to move that needle further, and we're trying to move it into, like, why aren't we using this particular device to look at condition X and biometric Y as the primary endpoint. And I think we just need to demonstrate that these devices are at least equivalent through a 510(k) submission and have an FDA approval. And we are seeing some of the commercial devices that are getting that for measurement of atrial fibrillation in several of the watches, or temperature detection. But we're also seeing these companies, these sensor manufacturers, they're now going to the payers to get them to understand the importance of making this part of regular healthcare. BioIntelliSense is a great example of a company that we work with. They have a bio sticker that's just a little patch you put on your chest, and wear it and forget it. And we can get vital signs all day long from a person wearing that. It's actually used from the COVID vaccine. They have a smaller version, the COVID button, which I think one or two small countries in the Caribbean are actually using that as a mandatory device when you come in the country to monitor your temperature, those kind of things. And we're going to see this. It's slow going, but we need to demonstrate that these devices are at least as effective or more effective than these other devices. So I think I went a little long there.
No, not at all. But we do have the cue from Justin that this is officially the wrap on this panel. Thank you all for joining today. Really insightful.